You never expect to lose everything in a single moment. One morning, I woke up to find my entire world turned upside down. My $5 million dream home, the one I spent years building, was gone. Destroyed. And it wasn't some accident. No, it was deliberate. All thanks to Karen. A woman who thought she could do whatever she wanted, especially when it came to my property. First, I couldn't believe it. I was standing in the middle of what used to be my beautiful house, staring at the rubble, trying to figure out how this had happened. The place where I'd spent so many nights with my family, where we made countless memories, was now just a pile of broken wood and shattered glass. The irony hit me hard. Karen had thought she was the one in control, but she had no idea who she was messing with. I had spent my life building up this home brick by brick, and I wasn't about to let anyone tear it down, not even her. But Karen didn't just mess with the wrong house. She messed with the wrong person. You see, I wasn't just some ordinary guy with a dream home. I had the resources to fight back. I had the law on my side. And I knew exactly how to use it. When I first met Karen, she was one of those people who thought she had the power to run everyone's life. She was the president of the HOA, which meant she felt untouchable. The way she walked around, acting like she owned the entire neighborhood, rubbing elbows with the right people, it made my skin crawl. But I didn't care. I kept to myself, focusing on my family and my home. That was until she decided to go after what was mine. It started small, a few complaints about the way my property was landscaped. No big deal, right? But then things escalated. She started throwing around threats, trying to intimidate me into doing what she wanted. I didn't take kindly to that. But I didn't retaliate right away. No, I was patient. I was waiting for the perfect moment. And when she took that final step and destroyed my house, I knew it was time to make her regret ever crossing me. What she didn't know was that I had been preparing for this. I had been watching her every move, documenting everything. I wasn't just going to get angry and lash out. I was going to get even. I was going to make sure she paid for what she did. I wasn't just fighting for my home. I was fighting for everything I had worked for, everything my family had sacrificed for. And Karen, she was about to learn that messing with me was the biggest mistake of her life. I never expected things to escalate the way they did. At first, Karen seemed harmless. She was just another HOA president, the type who always seemed to have her nose stuck in other people's business. But it was more than that. She had this air about her like she was better than everyone else. It didn't take long for me to realize that she wasn't just another neighbor. She was the kind of person who believed her authority extended beyond what was written on any HOA bylaws. When she first started making her complaints, I brushed them off. Sure, she didn't like the way my grass was cut, or maybe the color of my mailbox didn't match the approved shade. Little things that didn't matter in the grand scheme of things. But then it started getting personal. It wasn't just about rules anymore. She began to act like she owned the neighborhood, like my house was somehow hers to control. That's when I knew I couldn't just sit back and let her keep pushing me around. But I also knew that taking her head on wasn't the smartest move. No, I needed to think this through. I needed to be strategic. As much as I wanted to confront her, I had to be careful. I knew the HOA's game and I knew how they played. They had money, power, and influence, and they weren't afraid to use it. But I also had something they didn't have. Patience. I had learned a long time ago that patience was more powerful than anger. I watched her every move, taking note of her actions, her words. And I found something. Something that would turn the tables in my favor. It wasn't much at first, just a few emails, some documents, but enough to make me wonder if Karen had been hiding something. The more I dug, the clearer it became. Karen was breaking the rules. She was using her position in the HOA to push her own agenda, and if I played my cards right, I could expose her. I wasn't going to let her get away with what she did. I wasn't going to let her tear my life apart, not without consequences. But I had to be careful. One wrong move and I could lose everything. So I kept playing the long game. I collected evidence, built my case, and waited for the perfect moment to strike. It wasn't about revenge. It was about justice. It was about making sure she learned that no one is above the law, not even someone like Karen. And when that moment came, I knew exactly what I had to do. I was ready to fight back, and this time it wasn't going to be just about a few petty complaints. It was going to be about taking control of my own life again. It was time. Karen had made her move, and now it was my turn. I had been watching her, learning everything I could about her, and now I had the perfect plan to turn the tables. She thought she could break the rules and get away with it, but what she didn't know was that I had been gathering all the pieces, and soon I was going to use them to destroy everything she had worked so hard to build. The first step was simple. I needed to make sure she knew I wasn't backing down. I started small, sending a few letters to the HOA board, documenting everything that had happened. I wasn't just complaining about her, I was gathering evidence that she had overstepped her authority. Then I filed a formal complaint, one that would force her to face the consequences of her actions. I made sure to include every detail, every shady move she'd made, and every rule she'd broken. But I didn't stop there. I knew the power of silence. I waited for her to react. And sure enough, she did. Karen didn't take kindly to being called out, especially not in front of her precious HOA members. She tried to intimidate me, of course. She sent a few threatening emails, hoping to scare me into backing off. But by now I was ready. I anticipated this. I ignored her. The silence was deafening for her. She thought she could bully me into submission, but she didn't realize I had been preparing for this moment for weeks, even months. I was in control now. What she didn't know was that I had one final move left to make. I reached out to a lawyer, someone who understood exactly how to fight back against people like Karen. Together, we crafted a plan that would expose her for who she really was. The moment we made our move, I knew it was game over for her. But I wasn't done yet. I had another trick up my sleeve. I had already secured a meeting with the city council to present my case. The board had no idea what was coming, but I did. And when I stood in front of them, I wasn't just some angry homeowner. I was someone who had done his homework, who had the law on his side, and who was ready to show them just how far Karen had gone to get what she wanted. I made sure every word was sharp, every detail was crystal clear. And when I was done, there was no way she could deny what she had done. Karen's world was about to crumble. She had thought she could run everything, but in the end it was me who was in control. It wasn't just about getting back at her. It was about making sure she knew she couldn't just trample over people without consequences. And when it was over, she would realize that sometimes, the quiet ones are the ones you should fear the most. I could feel the tension building in the air as the day of the meeting with the city council approached. Karen had no idea what was coming. The moment I walked into that meeting, I knew this was the turning point. I had been waiting for this day, carefully planning every move, making sure I had everything in place. Karen thought she could manipulate the system, use her position in the HOA to bully people into submission, but she was about to find out that the system could be used against her too. The room was filled with people, some of them were curious, others were clearly on Karen's side, but I didn't care. I was there to make sure the truth came out. The council members called the meeting to order, and I could hear the murmurs of the crowd as they settled into their seats. When it was finally my turn to speak, I stood up, walked to the podium, and took a deep breath. I knew I had to stay calm, collected, and above all, I had to be clear. I began by explaining the situation, laying out every detail of what Karen had done. I spoke about the destruction of my property, the threats, the constant harassment. But I didn't stop there. I showed them the documents, the emails, the records, the evidence that Karen had been abusing her power. It was like watching a bomb go off in slow motion. One by one, the council members flipped through the pages, their faces changing from curiosity to concern. And then the moment came. I dropped the final piece of the puzzle. I showed them the legal loopholes Karen had used to bypass the rules, the lies she had told to manipulate the system, the shady deals she had made to cover her tracks. The room went silent. You could feel the weight of the truth in the air. Karen was sitting there, her face turning red, her hands gripping the armrests of her chair. She knew she had been caught. I could see the panic in her eyes, the realization that all her power, all her influence meant nothing now. As I finished speaking, I sat down, letting the silence hang in the air for a moment longer. The council members exchanged glances, and I could tell they were weighing their options. And then the chairperson spoke. "We will be investigating this matter further," he said, his voice steady. "Thank you for bringing this to our attention." Karen didn't say a word. She just sat there fuming, but I knew deep down she knew her time was up. The wheels of justice were already in motion. The next few weeks were a blur. I had done what I set out to do, but I wasn't done yet. Karen was going to pay for what she had done, and I wasn't going to let her get away with it. The investigation into her actions was just the beginning. And when the dust finally settled, I knew she would learn a lesson she'd never forget. There's no escaping the consequences of abusing power. The next few weeks were the longest of my life. As I waited for the investigation to unfold, I couldn't help but replay every moment in my mind. Every conversation with Karen, every confrontation, every email that I had saved. It was like watching a slow-motion train wreck. Karen's world was falling apart, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. The council members had promised to investigate her actions, but I knew they had to move carefully. They couldn't just make accusations without proof, and I had given them all the ammunition they needed. I had laid out everything in front of them. The destruction of my property, the shady dealings, the threats, it was all there in black and white. The waiting game wasn't easy. Karen, on the other hand, was growing more desperate by the day. I could see it in the way she carried herself, the frantic emails she sent, the attempts to intimidate me that only made me more determined. She knew she was losing, and it showed. But I wasn't just sitting back and watching. I had a plan. I reached out to more people who had been affected by her. I wasn't the only one she had bullied. There were others, neighbors who had been too afraid to speak up, too intimidated to do anything. But now they were ready. I gathered testimonies, documents, even recordings. I wanted to make sure that when the time came, Karen wouldn't just lose her position, she would be exposed for who she truly was. The pressure was building, and I knew it wouldn't be long before the council took action. Sure enough, one afternoon, I received a call from the council chairperson. The investigation was over. They had reviewed everything, and it was clear. Karen had abused her position in the HOA, violated multiple laws, and caused harm to others. They were recommending her removal from the HOA, and they would be forwarding their findings to the authorities. It was a bittersweet victory. I had won, yes, but it had taken everything I had. The emotional toll, the stress, the constant pressure, it had all been worth it in the end. But for Karen, this was only the beginning. Her reputation was in tatters, and soon, her connections would no longer protect her. When the news hit, I could feel the weight lift off my shoulders. Karen had finally faced the consequences of her actions. I didn't need to say anything. Her downfall was public enough. But I knew she would never forget the lesson she had learned. Power isn't something you can just take and use without consequences. And for the first time in a long while, I felt like I could breathe again. The justice I had been fighting for had been served. But more than that, I had taken back my life. I had stood up for myself and for others who couldn't, and in doing so I had proven that sometimes the most powerful weapon isn't force or threats. Simply doing what's right. The fallout from the council's decision was swift, and it didn't take long for everyone to know what had happened. Karen's removal from the HOA was just the beginning of her troubles. The story spread like wildfire through the neighborhood, and I could already see her face when the news hit. She had always been so confident, so sure of herself, and now she was being torn down in front of everyone she had once controlled. The most satisfying part wasn't just the public shaming or the fact that she lost her position. No, it was knowing that I had been the one to make it happen. It felt like I had finally gotten the closure I needed. For months, Karen had made my life miserable. She had tried to tear my world apart, and for a while it felt like I was fighting an uphill battle, just trying to hold on. But now it was her who was struggling to keep her life from falling apart. As I watched her face in the meetings, it was clear that she was realizing just how much she had underestimated me. She had thought she could use her power to push me around, but in the end, it was her own arrogance that had been her downfall. No one likes being exposed, and when you've been living a lie as long as Karen had, it can be a hard thing to accept. What really hit home for me was when I received an apology from some of my neighbors. People who had once been afraid to speak out against her came forward, acknowledging that I had been right all along. They thanked me for standing up to her, for showing them that it was possible to fight back against the injustice in their own lives. It was a humbling experience, but it also reminded me why I had done it in the first place. It wasn't just about Karen. It was about making sure that no one else had to live in fear of someone like her. But while I was getting all the praise, Karen's world continued to crumble. The HOA voted to remove her from any further involvement in the community. Her so-called friends disappeared, and her reputation, once a symbol of power, was now nothing more than a joke. I remember seeing her one last time at a neighborhood meeting. She didn't speak, didn't make eye contact. She was a shell of the person she once was. For a brief moment, I almost felt sorry for her. But then I remembered everything she had done, everything she had put me and others through. She had earned this. As time passed, the neighborhood began to heal. People started to feel safe again, knowing that they weren't going to be bullied or threatened by the very people who were supposed to protect them. I didn't need to gloat, I didn't need to remind anyone what I had done. It was enough just knowing that I had stood up for what was right, that I had fought back against the injustice and won. Karen's reign of terror was over, and with it, a new chapter began for everyone else. It wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about making things right, about restoring balance where it had once been lost. And that was the real victory. As time passed, life began to return to normal. The weight that had been hanging over me for so long slowly lifted, and the community began to heal. Karen's absence was noticeable not just because she wasn't there, but because the power dynamic had shifted. For so long she had made everyone feel small, like their voices didn't matter, that she could control every aspect of their lives. But now that grip was gone. It was almost surreal how quickly things changed. Neighbors who had once been too afraid to stand up for themselves started to speak out, to make their own decisions without fear of her judgment. And I found myself with a new sense of purpose. I realized that this wasn't just about my house or my victory over Karen. It was about something bigger. It was about making sure the people around me felt safe, heard, and respected. Over the next few months, I found myself involved in community projects, organizing events to bring everyone together, and to rebuild the sense of unity that had been broken by Karen's tyranny. It wasn't easy, but it was worth it. Slowly, the neighborhood that had once been divided, full of quiet resentment and hidden fear, began to find its voice again. And it felt good to be a part of that change. I wasn't doing this to get credit or recognition. I was doing it because I believed in what was right. I wanted to be the kind of person who made things better, not just for myself but for everyone around me. It was a slow process, but eventually the community became stronger than ever. People started to trust each other again, and the fear that had once ruled the streets seemed to vanish. Karen's legacy was fading, and in its place, a new sense of empowerment was growing. And though I had been the one to bring Karen down, I couldn't help but feel proud of the way the neighborhood had risen from the ashes. It was a reminder that even in the darkest of times, there is always a chance for renewal. And as for me, I had learned a valuable lesson. That standing up for what's right isn't always easy, but it's always worth it in the end. I had fought for my home, for my peace of mind, and for the people I cared about. And that was a victory I could carry with me, knowing I had made a real difference. It had been a few months since Karen's downfall, and the neighborhood had found a new rhythm. Things were different now. People were no longer hiding in the shadows, afraid to speak up, afraid to stand their ground. They were reclaiming their sense of community, and I could see the change in the air. It was as if the entire place had been given a fresh start. Neighbors who had once whispered about Karen's manipulation now sat together, laughing and talking about their plans for the future. They weren't afraid anymore, and it felt like I had been a part of that change, a part of the reason they had the courage to be themselves again. It was a quiet satisfaction, knowing that the fight wasn't just mine. It was everyone's. But for me, the work wasn't done. I couldn't just sit back and relax now that the storm had passed. I realized I had a responsibility to keep this momentum going, to make sure the peace we had found didn't slip away. I started organizing more events, bringing people together in ways that Karen never would have allowed. I helped set up neighborhood cleanups, barbecues, and block parties. The kind of things that made people feel like they belonged, like they were part of something bigger than themselves. I remember one afternoon, as I was cleaning up after a community event, a neighbor I had never really spoken to came up to me. He looked a bit hesitant at first, but then he smiled and said, "I just wanted to thank you. You know, after all the mess with Karen, I didn't think things would ever get back to normal. But seeing everyone come together like this, it's really something." I smiled back, feeling a warmth in my chest. That was what it was all about. Not the victory over Karen, not the legal battles or the moments of triumph. It was about the community, about making sure the people who lived here felt safe, valued, and heard. That was my real win. And as time went on, it became clear that the community had learned something too. They learned that they didn't have to be afraid of people like Karen. They didn't have to bow down to authority figures who tried to control them. They learned that they had a voice, and together they were stronger. And for me, that was all I needed to know. I had done my part. The rest was up to them. As the months turned into years, I watched as the neighborhood continued to thrive. It became a place where people looked out for each other, where the sense of unity I had fought for became a permanent fixture. It was a far cry from the fear that had once gripped this place. It was a place where people were free to be themselves, where the actions of one person no longer dictated the lives of the others. And every time I walked down the street, every time I saw a neighbor wave hello, I knew that I had been a part of something truly special. I had fought for what was right, and in the end it wasn't just about me. It was about all of us. Years passed, and the neighborhood continued to grow stronger. The memories of Karen's reign of terror faded, replaced by a renewed sense of community. People no longer whispered in fear when they passed by each other's houses. They smiled, they waved, and they helped one another. I had become more than just the guy who stood up to Karen. I became the person people turned to when they needed advice, when they needed someone to listen. Felt good. Felt right. As I walked down the street, I realized just how much had changed. The houses that had once seemed so impersonal now felt like home. People were taking pride in their properties, making improvements not because they had to, but because they wanted to. They were taking ownership of their community in a way that was truly inspiring. But it wasn't just the neighborhood that had changed. I had changed too. I had gone from a man who was simply trying to protect his property to someone who had become a catalyst for change. I had learned that sometimes it's not enough to simply fight for what's yours. Sometimes you have to fight for others, for the greater good, for the community. And that realization was more powerful than anything Karen had ever thrown my way. The best part? I didn't need to keep fighting. The battle had been won. The changes were permanent and the lessons were learned. I could walk down the street without feeling that knot in my stomach, without wondering if I would have to deal with another round of intimidation or manipulation. And as for Karen, she had become a shadow of the person she once was. The whispers about her had turned into pity. She had lost everything she thought she could control. I didn't need to gloat. I didn't need to say anything. The truth was clear for everyone to see. The one thing that remained with me, though, was the sense of peace that had settled over the neighborhood. It wasn't just about me getting back what I had lost. It was about everyone else getting back what they had been denied. Their voice, their freedom, their peace of mind. That was the real victory. As I sat on my porch one evening, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink, I realized something. This wasn't just about one man standing up to a tyrant. It was about a community coming together, finding strength in one another, and standing up for what was right. And in the end, that's what made all the difference. I had fought for what mattered and I had won. But more importantly, we all had.